Hi everybody, and welcome to this Introduction to Global Priorities Research with Rossa O'Keeffe-O'Donovan. My name's Bridget and I'll be the MC for the session. So to start off, we'll have a 20-minute talk by Rossa, and then we'll move to a live Q&A session where he'll respond to some of your questions. So you can submit questions using the box to the right-hand side of this video, and you can also vote for your favorite questions to push them higher up in the list. But now I'd like to introduce our speaker for this session. Rossa O'Keeffe-O'Donovan is a postdoc in economics at the University of Oxford and assistant director at the Global Priorities Institute. He previously studied philosophy, politics, and economics as an undergraduate, worked for a development charity and economics consultancy, and completed a master's and PhD in economics. Here's Rossa.
Okay, thanks very much for coming to this session. I'm Rossa O'Keeffe-O'Donovan. I'm the assistant director at GPI, and I'm in charge of building the economics research team at GPI. I'm also an economist at the University of Oxford, where I'm a postdoctoral researcher. Today, I want to give an introduction to global priorities research. So I'll kind of start off by discussing what I think global priorities research is, and I'll kind of start by discussing that this is a kind of contested definition. Then I'll talk about which organizations work in this space. And then finally, I'll add a few thoughts about what you might do if you're a student who's interested in global priorities research. I should also start off by giving a disclaimer that everything I talk about are my own views rather than the views of GPI or the University of Oxford. So the first thing to start with is, well, what is global priorities research? And I think it's important to note there's no single definition here. So I've added a couple, but there will be others out there. The first is GPI's definitions. This is what we have on our website. So we think global priorities research is research that informs the decision-making of individuals and institutions seeking to do as much good as possible. 80,000 Hours says GPR, or global priorities research, is research that rigorously investigates what the most important global problems are, how we should compare them to each other, and what kinds of interventions best address them. So there are two different definitions. But yeah, there's other organizations that would kind of have a slightly different definition of global priorities research. We're going to spend the first few minutes kind of talking about what my own views are about what global priorities research is and also what it isn't. So first thing to say is that global priorities research is not the same as cause prioritization research, in my opinion at least. So I think the best way to think about this is this Venn diagram on the left, and I think this is closest to my own view, where cause prioritization research is a subset of global priorities research. And so the kind of idea here is that there are some topics that might kind of fit under global priorities research, which don't really require you to compare the effectiveness of different causes. And what I have in mind here is what I've called foundational research. An example of this is the question, are we living at the hinge of history? So if you kind of did some research to try and better understand this question, this would really help you kind of figure out what the kind of best actions you can take might be, but it's not directly comparing two different causes. It's not directly prioritizing between two different causes. And so here's where I think global priorities research is distinguished from cause prioritization research. Other people might kind of use this Venn diagram on the right. I think it would be pretty reasonable, but they might say, well, cause prioritization research and global priorities research, they have this overlap in the middle, but there's some topics, maybe the foundational research topics, that are GPR or global priorities research, and there's some which are kind of cause prioritization research, but not global priorities research. I think that'll be a pretty reasonable view as well. But for me, the two things are not exactly equal to each other. The second thing to say is that global priorities research is not the same as GPI or what GPI works on. And so I want to be quite clear on this because global priorities research is bigger than GPI, and it's not just this kind of subset of questions that GPI has chosen to focus on. So down here, I've got this other Venn diagram where I think that GPI is kind of a subset of all the global priorities research that could and should and is happening in the effective altruism movement, but also kind of in other areas. So before I go into a bit more detail on that, I think I should give a bit of background on GPI. So we were founded in January of 2018, and our mission statement, as on our website, says, we're founded to do world-class foundational academic research on how to do good most effectively. So we have about 12 researchers at the moment, 12 full-time researchers. We also are trying to kind of cultivate a network of other people who are doing research in academia that is relevant to the question of how to do good most effectively. And then we have a couple of kind of programs of how we engage with students or kind of recent graduates in various ways. So one is we have a PhD visitor program each summer. We call it the Early Career Conference Program. And the other is we kind of employ economics predoctoral researchers or predoctoral research fellows. The idea there is for recent graduates, especially those who have taken economics as part of their undergraduate, they come and work at GPI for a year or two. They kind of get some experience doing global priorities research. And some of it is kind of research assistant work, and some of it is kind of independent research. And the hope is that this sets them up well to go on to do graduate research. This is why we call it a predoctoral research fellowship. So zooming back into this question of what is global priorities research, and my argument that it's not defined by what GPI focuses on, I think there's three key aspects to this. The first is that GPI focuses quite narrowly on research questions related to long-termism. Now, this is true for the time being. This is partly a kind of tactical decision to have a relatively narrow research focus so different researchers can build on each other's ideas. It's also because we think research on long-termism is just really important, and we think that there's quite a lot that can be contributed by doing high-quality academic research related to long-termism. But that's our focus for now. But I think there is global priorities research that can and should be done on topics that aren't related to long-termism. The second way that GPI is quite narrow relative to global priorities research as a whole is that we only focus on economics and philosophy. Again, this is for the time being. We kind of anticipate that we might expand into other fields as the years go by and as GPI grows. But yeah, for the time being, and probably for the next couple of years, we will still retain our focus on economics and philosophy. And then a third way in which GPI's research focus is more narrow than global priorities research as a whole is that we focus only on academic research. And so let me talk a little bit more about that, because I think this is quite an important point to make, and also possibly a bit of a misperception within the effective altruism community. So my personal view is that global priorities research includes and should include both academic research and non-academic research. So GPI was set up to do academic research, so to focus on the former. And the idea is that there's some questions that might be very useful for helping people to do as much good as they can, where those questions benefit from having academic rigor. So in academia, we have the kind of luxury to spend a lot of time thinking about a research question, spend some time developing our hypotheses, to kind of get a lot of feedback through the academic process of giving seminar presentations, writing drafts and getting feedback on your drafts. And it can take us months, possibly years. In economics, it's quite common for papers to take a number of years before we have the kind of finished product. And some people would argue your product is never finished. And we think there are some really important questions that kind of require and benefit from that level of academic rigor. A kind of very good example is Hilary Graves and Will McCaskill's paper on the strong case for long-termism. Sorry, the case for strong long-termism. But I think there are other questions to do with global priorities research and that are included in global priorities research that are best addressed by non-academic research. And so a couple of points here. So the first is that in academia, we have the incentives to publish in kind of prestigious journals, and there are pressures that come with that, and it kind of changes, or it can change, some of the topics that you work on. Now, this isn't always true for GPI, so we will work on papers that we think aren't likely to publish in extremely prestigious journals if we think they're important enough. And the reason they might not publish so well is if it's on a topic that's kind of outside the scope of mainstream academia. But there are times where we will work on those papers because we think, that the question requires a level of rigor that is typical of academia. We think that level of rigor is useful for the question, and we think that question is going to be extremely important for actors who are trying to do as much good as they can. The second point I want to make on the difference between academic and non-academic GPR is that sometimes kind of non-academic research can be closer to the decision maker and can be more practical. So again, here in academia, because we kind of have certain methodologies, because we want to try and publish some of our research, you want to kind of use certain types of research that are possibly kind of more foundational but less decision relevant for people who might be trying to do good. It might be policymakers, it might be philanthropists. And so I think global priorities research should and is happening outside of academia to kind of address those questions. So within academia, I think there's also a bit of a debate about what should global priorities become. And we talk about this at GPI, where we sometimes discuss, are we trying to create a field? Are we calling that field global priorities research? Or are we trying to influence a number of existing fields to kind of work on questions that we think are very important for people trying to do good? So I think the kind of one possible comparison here is behavioral economics. So over the last 20 to 30 years, behavioral economics has developed its own field, and that field kind of sits between economics and psychology. And that in itself has kind of allowed them to call behavioral economics a new field. And I think that possibly global priorities research will evolve to that state where we will be seen as our own field. And that might be very useful because behavioral economics has become very influential, both for policymakers and for academics alike. But on the other side of the argument, well, global priorities research draws from many different existing fields, so economics, philosophy, psychology, a bunch of others, and we contribute to those fields, or we hope to contribute to those fields. And we use different tools from those different fields. And so it might not make sense for global priorities research to be seen as its own field. Maybe it might make more sense for it to be seen as contributing to these existing fields. One other possible comparison I want to make for global priorities research is the kind of field or area of impact evaluation. So here again, here I don't think you would think of impact evaluation as a field as such, not in the academic sense, but it's a kind of area of research where there's academic research going on and there's non-academic research. And so I think impact evaluation, and here I'm talking about impact evaluation mostly in development economics because it's the area I know best. I think the kind of foundations of that were laid in academic research. But now if you kind of look at impact evaluation, a lot of the research is going on outside of an academic setting. And I think global priorities research will evolve into a similar type of field where some of the work going on is in academic settings and some of it is going on in non-academic settings. So I've spoken a bit about the Global Priorities Institute, and I wanted to mention a few other organizations that are working in GPR, in Global Priorities Research. I won't spend long talking about these, in part because many of these organizations are also talking at this conference, and so you should go and check out those talks to learn a bit more about them. The Forethought Foundation is somewhat of a partner institute for GPI. They've basically been set up to also focus on long-termism, and they're trying to develop a network of academic researchers who kind of work in this area. They're also largely focused on economics and philosophy, but they have a slightly broader focus than GPI. They run some scholarships. They have a thesis prize for undergraduates. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. The Future of Humanity Institute, we also know quite well because they're also based in Oxford. And they also kind of focus on questions related to long-termism, and they have a number of kind of sub-teams who work on various projects. Rethink Priorities have typically focused on questions, or previously they focused on questions related to animal welfare, but I understand they've kind of hired a few more researchers recently, including some economists. So Dave Bernard is talking tomorrow, and they've kind of expanded their research team, and I think they are likely to expand their research focus as well. But they've clearly been doing work that I think is part of global priorities research. The Urban Philanthropy Project, I think many of you will know quite well. They typically don't do academic research, although sometimes I think they do produce things that are that could be termed as academic research. And they've clearly made a lot of progress in global priorities research and figuring out answers to questions that are very relevant for people trying to do the most good. I won't talk about many of these other organizations, but I think to varying degrees, they do kind of research that is part of global priorities research. So Founders Pledge, 80,000 hours. The Legal Priorities Project is a new organization that I think Rossa O'Keeffe will speak about later today. The Effective Altruism Foundation, and then a bunch of others. So I kind of already changed the font size on this slide to try and fit some more in, and I'm sure I've missed some organizations out there. So I'm going to apologize for missing out some organizations that do global priorities research. There's a few more on the slide. There's presumably a few others that I haven't put down. I think the best place to go is probably 80,000 hours to take a look at who else is working in this area. So part of this conference, I think, is designed to kind of give you some ideas about what you can do if you're interested in various subjects. And so here I wanted to kind of give a few thoughts on what you can do if you're a student and you're interested in global priorities research. So I think the first thing is to kind of study and hone your research skills. This might seem kind of obvious, but I think it's actually pretty important. I think it's the best way to kind of skill up, tool up, and get some experience doing high quality research. I've listed some relevant subjects here. So if there are some kind of freshmen in the US system or people thinking about applying to various programs, whether it's undergrad or graduate programs, I think some quite clearly relevant subjects are kind of economics, philosophy, maths, politics, stats, psych, law, computer science, and other social sciences. But yeah, there's probably others as well that I haven't mentioned here. Another organization I wanted to give a shout out to is the Effective Thesis. So they have a website, effectivethesis.org, and the idea there is whether you're an undergrad student or a graduate student, and if you're looking for a topic to do your thesis on, they've gone and they've kind of looked for research questions that are both quite kind of feasible for you to do a thesis on and would really contribute to global priorities research. So do check that out if you're kind of looking for a thesis topic. I'll mention a couple of other opportunities that might be relevant for people interested in this area. So the Forethought Foundation has an undergraduate thesis prize. I think they announced their winners very recently for the latest round. They also have some graduate fellowships. GPI, I mentioned before, we have a pre-doctoral program. It's only for economists at the moment. And then we have some PhD visitors in econ and philosophy each summer. And FHI also has a summer research fellowship, and I think that is broader in terms of the fields that they cover. There's a bunch of other positions, I'm sure, so check out the 80,000 hours job board if you're interested in working in this area, and I think they have a filter by global priorities research. Now, what can you do at this conference if you want to find out more about global priorities research? Well, I think Kit's already given his talk on which causes you might work on, but then there's a bunch of other talks coming up over the next day and then tomorrow as well. So straight after this section, there'll be some lightning talks by graduate students working on global priorities research. Then Rethink Priorities, so Jason will have a talk later today. Open Philanthropy Project, Forethought Foundation, OpenAI, and the Legal Priorities Project. Rethink, again, they will all be organizations that are working in global priorities research that are presenting at this conference. So do check out their sessions to find out more about exactly what they do and to kind of see some examples of global priorities research. There's also going to be two research presentations tomorrow, so by David Manley and by Hilary Graves. So David's going to be talking about Bayesian updating and Hilary on cluelessness in the long run. So check out those if you want to see some kind of examples of global priorities research. And in general, I would say stick about for the Q&As in these sessions and try and meet and chat with other people who are interested in this area. So I'm going to wrap up there. We've got a 15-minute live Q&A after this. I'm just going to end with this slide here. I think of all the resources out there, these are the four that I'd most recommend you look at. So the first is 80,000 hours page on global priorities research. So check that out if you're interested in this area. Second is GPI's research agenda. So actually we just published a new version of it. It's not a major update, but it's a minor update, and there's some new economics in there to kind of describe some of the research that we've done over the last 18 months and just to update what we think our current research priorities look like. And then there's a couple of posts on the EA forum about global priorities research that I think are particularly high quality and discuss some of the issues related to why global priorities research might be very important and the types of global priorities research or cause prioritization research that may not be happening, which would be very valuable for people to do. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks very much for coming to the session. I look forward to taking your questions. Cheers.
Okay, thanks so much for that talk, Rossa. Really interesting, and it's really great to have you here for this live Q&A. And I see you've also been one of the most efficient speakers ever, and you've already been answering the questions, which is great because there's heaps and it's good to get through them. So thank you for that. But yeah, welcome.
Thanks very much, Bridget.
So I think we'll just jump straight into it. One question I have is, what questions would you be most excited to see work on in this field?
Yeah, thanks very much. And yeah, also I'd say thanks for the questions. I will try and spend some time afterwards responding to some of them, but I'll try and get to all of them. But yeah, Bridget, on your question, in terms of what we're most excited to see, I'm going to use this opportunity to kind of plug the fact that GPI has recently posted a research agenda, like literally 3 days ago. It's not entirely new, but it's got some updates, and particularly on the econ side. I should also caveat that my answer is going to be more economics focused because I'm an economist, so I don't know as much what we're excited to see on the philosophy side or in other fields. But 3 areas in particular I'll highlight, which are kind of new additions to our research agenda. So one is to do with institutions. So this is an area that GPI is particularly interested in from a long-termist perspective, largely because there's some research in economics and economic history which shows that there are very long-run persistent effects of institutions. And so one way you might reliably or predictably influence the far future is through changing or redesigning institutions today. So this is something we haven't done much of, but we're kind of actively considering expanding into in the next couple of years. So at the moment at GPI internally, we're doing a bit of exploration research about what that research agenda might look like. Then 2 other areas we are kind of we've added to our research agenda recently. One is kind of long-run forecasting. So here's the idea that you've kind of got this Philip Tetlock style of work where they do forecasts on a shorter time frame. To what extent can we extend that over longer time frames? Like in the first instance, you might look at over 20 or 30 years, but we're very interested in like what types of policies or actions can we predict the effects of over like much larger timescales. So in the first instance, maybe 100 years, but possibly thousands of years out as well. So that's something that's very difficult, and we're not sure how much progress we're going to be able to make on that, but we're keen to see more thinking in that area. And then a third section we've added to the research agenda we're also excited to see more work on is kind of the effect of long-run growth, how we can affect long-run growth, and the effect of things like new technologies and long-run growth. And this kind of speaks to the arguments about should we have broad-based policies that try to just improve growth more generally for the long run, or should we focus on like more narrow or specific ways of trying to improve the long-term future?
Cool. That all sounds really interesting and exciting. So exciting to see what comes from it. As you mentioned, GPI's focus is very much on long-termism and the long-term future. I think there's a really interesting question here that's been sent through about whether you'd be interested in research that was, I guess, more skeptical of long-termism. Is that something that you'd like to see done?
Yeah, definitely. This is a really good question, and I was glad that someone raised this in the chat. I think there is a bit of a misperception that GPI is like, to some extent, the defender of long-termism, or we're trying to like push this idea that long-termism is the most important cause area. And I don't think that's the case. Like, we're very much like focusing our research on long-termism, but the reason is we want to try and better understand the arguments for or against long-termism and the implications of long-termism if it is correct in some form. So I won't speak for the kind of philosophy research team in terms of details, but I know that they're very interested in finding out more about which different views of the world would support long-termist conclusions. So they're actively trying to encourage that, and actually internally some of the papers that the philosophy team at GPI are writing are about exploring how robust long-termist reasoning is to different assumptions or different worldviews or different kind of philosophical models. On the economic side, I think we're also keen to see kind of skeptical research, in particular on the question I mentioned before about like, well, how much can we actually predict the effects of our actions in the very long run? And I think it's quite natural for economists to be quite skeptical about that because we're not great at forecasting things even a few years out, let alone hundreds or thousands of years out. Actually, Christian Tasny has a paper. He's on a philosophy team where he kind of explores this kind of potential flaw in a long-termist argument. So we're definitely keen to see more research on that on the econ side too, but also in other fields. So I'm focusing a lot on econ and philosophy. They're the fields I know the best, but we'd also be keen to kind of see research which is skeptical of long-termism and really tests the kind of strength of the long-termist argument and the strength of its implications.
Yeah, cool. So we only have time for one more question, but there's a few questions in the chat that are, I guess, around how students can either test their pitch or set themselves up to get involved in global priorities research, either as an undergraduate or as a graduate. Yeah, do you have any suggestions for those sorts of?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And so I had a slide on this, and I'll just kind of reiterate a couple of things on that. So I think probably the best way, if you're an undergraduate or a graduate student, is to start trying some of the research yourself. And so if you have the opportunity to do a thesis, especially if it's in a relevant topic, whether it's in the social sciences or something else, if you have the option to kind of do some research that's relevant to global priorities research or long-termism, I think that's a really good way of trying it out. Beyond that, I think if you can do, it's difficult to find these good positions, but if you can find like good research assistant roles, GPI's got a pre-doc program in economics that we'll be advertising for in the next few weeks. So there are opportunities to kind of work with EA organizations, but also non-EA organizations. And the best place to look out for there is, I think, the ATK job board. So yeah, basically trying out this research and learning more about it seems to be the best way.
Yeah,
Cool.
Makes a lot of sense. Cool. Well, unfortunately, we're over time, but there are still a few more questions, and thank you. You very kindly offered to stay on a little bit and answer those. So thanks for that, Rossa. But yeah, thanks very much for joining us. And for everybody at home, before you go, if you could give us a feedback in the polls section of the live chat, that would be really helpful. But thanks everybody for attending the session.
Thanks very much, Bridget, and thanks everyone for joining. This was great discussion in the chat, and I'll stick about and try and answer the remaining questions. Cheers.